and the lady is going to tell you that we're recording this session so that we can share it with people who may not be able to join at this time, but might be joining via the recorded version. So welcome to all of you joining for this afternoon session of the second in three of a series of roundtables exploring what it's going to take to create a climate resilient cotton sector and looking at adaptation to the impacts of climate change on cotton. I'm Charlene Collison. I'm the Associate Director at Forum for the Future, and I'm joined by a number of my colleagues from Forum and from Willis Towers Watson and Acclimatize to bring you this afternoon's conversation. If we can go to the next slide, I'll just take you through a few introductory bits to frame today's conversation before we get into the heart of the matter. So today is about looking at adaptation in climate change to climate change in the cotton sector and across the cotton sector. And it comes out of the reality that climate change is significant. It's real. Whatever we do, it is now going to affect the way all agricultural commodities are grown. And this conversation is about cotton in particular. And our focus today is on how the sector can adapt to increase its resilience and to develop the industry to be able to thrive in the different weather that is coming. Our focus is on adaptation rather than mitigation. Mitigation is also critically important, but that's not our focus for today. And we're looking at what the opportunities are to take action now so that we're more prepared for tomorrow. If we go to the next slide, please. Just a brief introduction. This session is brought by Forum for the Future, and I'm joined by my colleague Dhaval Nagandi, who's going to be kind of co-chairing this session with me, and he'll introduce himself in a moment. And Forum for the Future, for those of you who don't know us, is a sustainability NGO that really uses the lens of systems change and futures to focus action on critical global challenges. And Willis Towers Watson is, for those of you who don't know, a global advisory that looks at risk paths and Acclimatize, as it until recently was called, has been working alongside us to really do a thorough analysis of the climate risks from a very rigorous point of view and mapping out the risks and opportunities that climate change is likely to bring to cotton. We'll hear more about them in a moment. If we can go to the next slide. I want to just briefly say a few words about Cotton 2040 as a whole, because the focus on adaptation that we're doing today is just one part of Cotton 2040's work. For about 5 years, Cotton 2040 has been working with partners across the sector to create collaborative action in the areas that are really critical for the industry's future. And in particular, it's been about building resilience in the face of a changing climate and increased disruption. It's also been working to identify new business models that could support the transition to a just and regenerative future. And we've been working to scale uptake of sustainable cotton across all the sustainable cotton standards and working in partnership with them. And if we go to the next slide, you can see the range of the partners that we have been working with. In particular, from cotton standards, programs and codes, from BCI to Textile Exchange to Cotton Made in Africa, Cotton Connect, OCOM, all those that you see here on the slide. Traders, processors, brands, retailers, we've really tried to get representation from across the supply chain with people who can act as our advisors, our critical friends, our sounding board for the strategies that we've been developing in this work. And special thanks go to the Loudest Foundation for funding that's made Cotton 2040 possible, and Zalando, who was our sponsor partner. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dhaval. Dhaval.
Thank you so much, Charlene. Thank you everyone for joining. Dhaval Negandhi, I'm the Associate Director for Climate at Forum for the Future. So just carrying it over, as Charlene said, a lot of climate risks are going to be impacting the cotton value chain and all the actors across the value chain. And we also recognize that the sector itself contributes to climate change, although our contribution isn't that significant, but we need to play a part as being part of the solution. So what is clear is in a climate disrupted world, we as a sector will require radical transformation, and collaborative action is going to be at the heart of that transformation that's required. So to support that collaborative transformative action that is needed, Forum for the Future and Acclimatize have partnered, and we brought out earlier this year two analysis. So the first was sort of the first of its kind global analysis that looked at how the risks of various hazards from climate are going to impact various cotton growing regions across the world. And we complemented that with an assessment of vulnerability in cotton growing regions. So that was based on how the risks would interact with the adaptive capacity of the communities in the cotton growing region. So I highly encourage you to look at these analyses if you have not already done so. Next slide, please. And now our intention is to sort of use that analysis and engage with the entire cotton sector, and this is where the roundtables are organized. So the first roundtable, and I see some of the familiar faces that were part of the first roundtable as well, where we started looking at what are the risks that the cotton sector is facing, and we started discussing the implications. We're going to build on that today, and to start thinking about what are the responses that are required to manage those risks that we've discussed. And then we will come back again next month, building on what we discussed today, to start thinking about what does collaborative action look like across the sector to build resiliency in the sector. So that's what the plan is for the three roundtables. Next slide, please. So just to sort of focus on what we are going to do today, we're basically looking at two questions. First, given the risks that we will again sort of quickly recap for everyone to get on the same page. Given the risks, what are the adaptation responses that are required for a just and regenerative cotton sector? And within that, we will also think about where the current efforts might be focused and where there might be gaps. So that is going to be the focus of today, adaptation responses in face of the risks. Next slide, please. So in terms of the agenda, we will quickly recap the climate risks that we've talked about in the report and we discussed in the first roundtable. We will share some of the adaptation frameworks that might be helpful to think about responses that might be required to tackle those risks, and then we will break out into two groups. We will discuss some of these responses. Then we will come back in the plenary and share what we have discussed in individual groups, and then we will close with what the next roundtable looks like. So that's going to be the plan for today. So if I could now hand it over to Erin to do a quick recap of the last session.
Thank you, Dhaval. Yes, so a quick recap then of what we did last time during the last working group. So we looked in detail, quite a bit of detail if you can remember, at the different key drivers of risk across these four regions identified here on the screen. So just a quick recap then of these key drivers, defined then as regions where there is a very high risk from these hazards across the regions. So we can draw out some key drivers associated with temperature, increase in temperature, so drought, insufficient rainfall across the majority of regions, heat stress being a predominant one, and of course wildfire common across all 4 regions. In addition, then, we can see some acute hazards, so the fluvial flooding, extreme storms, and so forth, and landslide risks. So just a quick recap then of the key drivers of risk across these particular regions. And the next slide, please. Yeah. We also went into breakout rooms, if you can remember, during the last working group, where we had different actors along the supply chain in different breakout groups, and we identified key risks associated with each hazard that we identified in the previous slide. So over the last few weeks, we've been busy in the background aggregating these risks to try and come up with some sort of a summary of what can we see as some key points and key results from this. And what we can present is a high-level overview of these risks. They're not quantified and they're not scientifically correct in a mathematical sense, if you'd like. They are fairly subjective, but they do give some sort of a cross-cutting, an idea of the cross-cutting issues, and an idea, they do paint some sort of an image, if you'd like, of the nature of the risks across the regions. So yes, as you can see on the screen, this is our attempt to visualize the different risks then. So what do we have? We've grouped the risks according to hazards. So we have heat stress, etc., along the y-axis. And then along the x-axis, we have the impact along the supply chain. So it's a stronger color that indicates a direct impact from that risk on that stage of the value chain. If it's the color slightly transparent, slightly faded, then it indicates an indirect impact along the supply chain. So what trends can we draw out of this then? We can see that no part of the supply chain is immune to climate risk. We've identified risks then that impact either directly or indirectly across each stage of the value chain. Some stages of the value chain have their own unique risks, unique direct risks. For example, wind. We can see that strong winds may impact the ability of seedlings to root early on in the season. And this can then have a knock-on indirect impact along the supply chain, but it's fairly concentrated as a direct risk at the production stage, while other risks are indirect. While other risks cause a direct impact along each stage of the value chain. For example, wildfire. So wildfire can destroy crops and farmlands directly at the production stage. It can equally destroy manufacturing units at the processing stage, and it can equally destroy shops, retail units, and so forth at the brands and retail end of the value chain. We also have indirect risks, of course, as risks impact downstream of the value chain. For example, if not enough rainfall is experienced in a particular region, this can cause cotton to change colour and to become poorer in quality, meaning then that the processing side of the value chain is impacted. They receive poorer quality cotton and may have to source their cotton then from elsewhere. And so we're seeing indirect risk across the value chain to different degrees, of course. We also identified the importance then of looking at climate change, not necessarily just at the, if you'd like, the core operations themselves, but to consider the influence, the spheres of influence beyond the core operation. And what do I mean then? So if you can remember from the last working group, we had a slide with the concentric circles. So the core operation, the influence on critical infrastructure, the inbound and outbound supply chains, and so forth. So an example I can draw out from here is storms. Strong winds may take out electrical cables, for example, causing the loss of power for multiple days. And this can impact not only farmers and processing units, but it can also impact the wider community. and so forth. So we're looking at the not just the core operations, but the wider impact as well. We have both chronic and acute events being identified, or hazards, sorry. So we have the impact of small incremental changes in temperature, for example, which might be increasing without us particularly noticing. But then on top of that, when you have an extreme weather event, an acute hazard as well, then that can exacerbate risk. So for example, a warmer than usual summer, a heat wave then on top of a warmer than usual summer might exacerbate the situation and exacerbate a stressed situation. But again, it's important to note then that the way this graph presents the risk, it makes them look like they happen in isolation. But of course, more than one risk can happen at the same time and during a growing season. So a farmer might be able to survive or just about cope with losing crops from a flood event early on in the season. But if multiple flood events continue to happen throughout the growing season, combined then with possibly heat stress and so forth, it might be a different story indeed. So it's important to look at the cumulative impact, the impact of various hazards at the same time, and the systemic approach along the supply chain then. And back to you, Deval.
Thank you so much, Erin. That's great, and hopefully it's given everyone a quick recap, and for people who could not join us last time, a good sense of summary of what we discussed last time. So let's give a quick sense check now. We're going to do a poll on Menti. So if you could open the link that will be shortly in the chat for a poll, or you could scan this QR code on your phone, or you could alternatively also, if you could have that screen back, open menti.com. Okay, so there's the link in your chat. If you could click on the link, you could scan the QR code on your phone, or you could open menti.com and enter this code. It will take you to a poll that would request you to identify the top risks, climate risks that you've experienced in your geographical region, and you could input 5 of them. Perhaps if you could do in the order of importance, that would be lovely. So start with the risk that you see is the most important, and then add as many risks as you think are important, and then we'll quickly just get a sense of among, yeah, okay, so these are the results. Yeah. Lovely. That's great. I think almost everyone has voted. So seems like a good distribution. Water stress and temperature seems to be sort of among the top risks, but precipitation, flooding, windstorms, and wildfires, as we've identified and as Erin shared, also continue to be important risks. So that sort of validates some of the things that that we discussed in the first roundtable. So that's great. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking out the time to enter the poll. Okay, let's move forward. So we quickly wanted to sort of take a couple of minutes just to frame the discussion. So given these risks that are significant and important in this geography, let's start to think about what are the responses that have the potential to manage those risks and build resilience across the sector. And as we do that, I feel it's important for us to sort of just frame this. So if you could turn to the next slide, please. What we are meaning by adaptation is not just quick technical fixes. So these are not just physical measures, But what we are looking at when we say adaptation is a whole suite of activities that create resilience across the supply chain. So these could be physical measures, but these could also be policy measures. These could also be social measures that empower communities. And this is sort of really important, because what we've seen until now is the adaptation responses that are being implemented. A lot of them tend to be sectoral. They are typically implemented at a particular individual actor scale within the supply chain, and are disconnected. And why we think this is really important is, as we've seen, there are going to be multiple risks spread across the value chain, and no single initiative is going to help us build resilience across the chain. So when we think about responses, we really need to think about responses that are systemic and are addressing some of the root causes of the problems we are facing, and not just sort of mere quick fixes to some of the problems that are visible. So think about responses that don't just prolong the status quo in terms of whatever the system might be delivering, but change the goals of the system itself in terms of delivering just and regenerative outcomes. So it's essentially not just sort of continuing with the system that we have, but is essentially creating a new way that we would require in future. So just to give you an example of that is, and a lot of you would have experienced this, several climatic risks that Erin shared might be relevant for some of the cotton growing regions. So this could be in terms of inadequate rainfall, heat stress, wildfires that will impact several growing regions across the globe. These would have cascading impacts on the manufacturing and processing units, and this could be via some of the impacts that ports or transportation routes might face. So some of these actors further down the value chain will experience their own impacts or risks, but several impacts that are sort of upstream the value chain would also cascade into this. So there's not going to be a single response that, for example, that is taken at a production scale will help build resilience across the value chain. So we would require a suite of responses, but we would also require those responses to be systemic and address multiple drivers, just to make that point. So let me now hand it over to Alistair to sort of give us some more understanding of the kinds of adaptation responses that we could potentially be looking at for us to sort of equip before we break out into the groups. Alistair.
Great, thank you. Great, so back a slide, please. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, it's important for us just to say now, isn't it, that in terms of the responses that we need to climate change overall, that we do need to have a twin track approach, that we do need to decarbonize, reduce our emissions. We know this for sure. This is what's been front and center at COP in Glasgow very recently. But we also need to think about how we can adapt to the inevitable changes that will occur, even if we were able to switch the switch today and stop all of our greenhouse gas emissions today. There's still sufficient locked into the system to create changes within our climate, our ecosystems, that will require us to adapt. So mitigation and reducing our greenhouse gases is very important. We're not de-emphasizing that, but just so everyone is aware, for the purposes of the conversation that we're going to have from now onwards, we're just focusing on the adaptation piece, okay? And in terms of adaptation, yes, well, I mean, it's about, you know, processes to adjust to the actual or expected climate and its effects. So it's about adjusting to weather-related risks that we might be seeing today, but also through the work that Erin has presented, thinking about that sort of longer-term view and how we need to adapt not just to conditions today, but to those in the future, and ultimately build a level of resilience. Now, when we think about adaptation, I think, well, where are we going to start? Such a big big thing to get our head around. So what we've done is, and what we typically do when we're working with a range of organizations on this, is start with a set of, or a series of, essentially 8 types of adaptation actions that you can take. And we're going to be using those to go through the exercises in a moment or two. So here's the first 4 of those kind of types of adaptation action or options that we could perhaps look at. So the first one is a sort of informational action. So that could be informational in terms of monitoring trends, whether it's at the farm level, gaining more information about how both the ecosystem or the climate more directly through, say, rainfall or whatever, how is that changing over time? So building up records, because detailed records aren't available all over the world. And so we need to be monitoring these conditions now and seeing how things are changing. Are there trends over time? So one of them is about sort of thinking about monitoring. Others are more informational about things like early warning systems, whether there's the ability to use sort of seasonal forecasting, all that kind of thing. So information which you're perhaps not gathering yourselves or is being gathered at the farm level, but it's being gathered by others. So and provided more in terms of information. So yeah, around early warning systems and seasonal forecasting, those are classic areas. But the other bit then, information, is about not just climate information, but more generally information that can help to make better decisions in a way. So, you know, training or having more sort of information around financial literacy, or even having access to internet, etc., etc. These are all informational changes, many of which will be pretty familiar to you anyway, but maybe from a different direction. But these are all adaptation actions, so really, really important. And the great thing about informational activities, they tend to be cheap or of no value, very little increased value. Sorry. So they tend to be the sort of low-hanging fruit, really. Another level of adaptation action is around sort of institutional governance. So if you're a brand or a retailer, that could actually be about your own governance, your own institutional arrangements, and how you're going to be dealing with challenges around climate. But it could equally be in terms of local or national government changes and policies and plans that need to be put in place to help to build resilience within a district or a particular area. But it's also about how many of you could be actually interacting with local governments to actually collectively come together to create these kind of solutions. There's no one actor can ever, you know, cure this. It really has to be a collaborative endeavor. In terms of capacity building, that's another area, thinking about skills and training, stakeholder engagement with communities, how actually bringing minds and people together to create collective solutions can be a very powerful way to think about adaptation. Maybe contracting and insurance, slightly more techie here, but are there parametric insurance solutions which will pay out when a climate-related threshold has been exceeded? Maybe that's to do with a certain level of extreme temperature or water scarcity. It pays out automatically to farmers to cover them for various losses. And perhaps it's around novel use of contracts throughout the value chain to actually share some of the climate-related risks. So there's a lot of, you know, potential in that particular area as well. When we look at the next 4, we could look at finance, whether we can tap into some of the $100 billion that need to be dispersed in terms of climate finance annually, which you probably heard about in the COP discussions. That was certainly something that was very much focused on, you know, how can we tap into that climate finance? What are the ways in which that we can access that to actually support the sort of work that we want to do within the cotton value chain? Obviously, philanthropic funding as well is key to that. And so, yeah, there's some really interesting areas around finance that I think we could probably get into and will do in some detail in the breakout sessions coming. Then you've got the operational aspects. Is the ways of doing things differently that doesn't require a lot of additional cost, but actually can help to alleviate some of the climate risks and perhaps look at some of the opportunities as well. Maintenance around irrigation, around water management, these are all sort of classic areas. And then we get to eventually things like physical modification, which is not where we should really be starting to look. It's not about saying, okay, we've got flood risk in a particular area, let's build a flood wall, because that's capital expensive, it's very expensive, capital intensive, hard engineering often, you know, those are big ticket items. We want to reach those points very much at the end of a thought process, not at the beginning, when some of these lower hanging fruit adaptation actions can actually create much better value and benefit in the shorter term. Obviously, there's nature-based solutions is a very key part to that, so that we don't go around just trying to, you know, defend ourselves from flooding by building concrete walls everywhere. And then obviously there's thinking about the social dimensions as well, about community programs and how they can interlink. And as I say, really bringing home this idea of looking for collective solutions that build on, you know, kind of systemic thought process, really, rather than thinking about here's a risk, here's a single solution in isolation. How can we bring multiple things together to actually create benefit? And engaging with communities is an absolutely brilliant way of drawing out those kind of values. So there's the 8. We'll be going into those in more detail through the discussions in a moment or two. So yeah, I'm going to hand back now. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. So we're coming to the point in this session where you're going to do the talking, all of you who've joined us. So we wanted to set the context and really give the framing to adaptation. And soon I'm going to hand over to you. And I just want to highlight a few things to bear in mind as you start to think about adaptation responses. One is think about whether an adaptation response is a kind of a single issue fix, or whether we can really address the environmental, social, and the economic outcomes. Because when we're looking for something that can really have an impact across the system, the more areas it can address, then the more potent it will be. So, for example, when you think about long-term contracting, that helps to give you know, greater financial security to a farmer, but it also, for example, helps him or her to invest more in their land, to invest in some of the new technologies, knowing that they've got a secure income. You know, it addresses more than just a single issue area. Another thing to think about is, does it really address the root causes of some of these challenges? Or is it just a kind of a band-aid measure? Is it just going to kind of help get through a particular tough patch? Or does it really address something that's underlying the inequalities or the unsustainability of a system? And really critically, and this is so important, we can't say this enough, does it just allow the current system to keep on working a little bit longer in, you know, in a less bad way? Or does it actually allow a new system to emerge? So, for example, you know, are we looking at adoption of forms of regenerative agriculture that really allow a different way of working to come into being in agriculture? Or are we looking at just, you know, using different types of treatments on the land that allows just the current system to perpetuate until it won't be able to anymore? Because we know that climate change is fundamentally going to change the conditions under which these systems work. So is it allowing a new system to emerge that can be resilient in a very disrupted future? Those are the kind of things we'd like you to think about. And if we can go to the next slide, please. We're going to go into breakouts. We've got 2 breakout rooms, and you're both going to discuss the same issues, but each group will take a different type of adaptation type of the 8 that Alistair presented just now. So one group will be with me, and we'll work with the informational, institutional, capacity building, contracting, ensuring types of adaptation response. And the other group will be working with Daval, and we'll be looking at areas like finance, operational changes, physical modifications, social changes. And we'll be looking at all stages across the value chain. So we're hoping that the groups that we get will present a mix. Some of you may bring perspectives around farming and production, others may come more from the brand and retailer angle. And we're just going to ask you to really chip in and help identify, what do you see as the key adaptation measures that are both in place, that are currently being implemented? What are you aware of that's out there in the world that's doing good work that you think is necessary and doing it effectively? And what are the kind of measures that don't exist, but we need to think about? Because what we want to get to out of this is identifying areas for priority responses and adaptation. So this is really helpful, hearing both sides of the spectrum. And if we go to the next slide, we'll come back and we'll share these in plenary. So actually, sorry, let's go back now, because we're going to break out into groups. So you'll be whisked away in a moment. And if you can, please turn your video on so you can see one another as you're involved in the conversation. We understand that sometimes that's not possible, but if you can, that always helps the quality of dialogue. And we'll see you back here in about just over 45 minutes. Okay, so in a moment, you'll be seeing a signal. Hi, everybody. Magic. Here we are in a different digital space. And what I thought would be nice to do, because we're a quite small group, is just to do a quick round of introductions so that we kind of have a sense of who's in the room. And just to start with your name, the organization that you're from, and you know, maybe just a tiny, just a sentence or two about the perspective that you bring. So if you're, you know, from a brand or retailer or farmer, producer, as we start the conversation. So about, you know, 30 seconds each. So maybe Hannah, can I pass to you and you can kind of kick it off?
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, evening, everybody. My name is Hannah Kaneen. I work very closely with Charlene on the Cotton 2040 program as the program lead, and I also work in sustainable value chains and livelihoods across many other different named commodities. Lovely to have you here. I will pick on someone next, shall I? Wim, can I choose you to introduce yourself?
And as Wim starts to introduce himself, you will see appearing a mirror board, which we're going to be working with. Don't worry, you won't have to work with it, but we're going to be capturing your responses on this board. So I'll explain that in a moment. Wim.
Yeah, okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Wim Heintjes. I work in an institute dealing with agriculture, food, and fisheries in Belgium. Among many other things and challenges, we work also, of course, on climate mitigation and climate adaptation from a primary production perspective in food crops, but also in bio-based crops. So that's my angle. And we have similar crops that deal with fiber or that produce fiber that are facing similar challenges as with cotton. So that's why I'm interested to join. So thank you.
Thank you. Welcome. I wonder, I'm going to pick on people and apologize. Nicola, would you like to follow that?
There you go, I'm on. Hello, everyone. I'm Nicola. I work for Anthesis. We're a sustainability consultancy. We work with Forum for the Future on the Cotton 2040 project. I mostly work on supply chain, sustainable supply chains for clothing and textile brands. My background is in the fashion industry. So I've worked for several big brands, so Timberland, Burberry, Alexander McQueen. And I've also worked in Burkina Faso with a organic cotton farming project. So mostly, I guess, for the brand perspective.
Great, thanks to have your perspective on the call. Kelly, how about you?
I'm Kelly Pepper. I'm the manager of Texas Organic Cotton Marketing Cooperative, which is a co-op of about 35 farmers in the Lubbock, Texas area that produce organic cotton. I have a background in both conventional farming and organic farming and business.
Thanks, Kelly. Glad you're with us today. Marcia.
Hi, everybody. It's hard to say my perspective. I am the founder of Cotton Diaries, which is a community network of cotton experts advancing cotton sustainability. We have 23 members across a variety of roles, and we have 5 youth ambassadors. And then I'm also the Intelligence Director of Transformers Foundation, which is an NGO representing the denim industry, also cotton farmers. And then I guess I come from the consulting world perspective, although I've worked within brands to advance sustainability strategies in raw material sourcing, especially with cotton.
Great, Marcia, glad you're with us.
Thanks.
Agnieszka.
Hi, Charlene. Hello, everyone. My name is Agnieszka. I work for a company called Cotton Connect. I'm a senior sustainability executive in Cotton Connect. So I'm bringing the perspective from the farmers level. Cotton Connect works with different brands and retailers, and we help source sustainable cotton to those companies. So hopefully I will be able to help you with some of the questions. I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
And we've heard a bit from Erin. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Erin.
No, I think I know most of you on the call. Nice to see you again. So yeah, Erin Owen, work with Willis Towers Watson and been project managing from our side of things for the last 2 years. On the mapping side, the results and data and so forth. So yeah, nice to see you all again.
Thanks. And Neil.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. I'm sure you've probably had enough of me pestering you with various emails, but I do have, I've just joined Forum about a month and a half ago, but before that I was actually working out in East Africa, primarily with smallholder farmers and also some renewables, but smallholder farmers working in coffee and a bit in, so coming also just with the perspective of seeing some of the frustrations I think that smallholders have on the ground as well. So it's been a fascinating series so far, and I'm really looking forward to this.
Great. And it's Neil who's the magic hands behind the Miro board. So he will be moving it around for us in a moment. And I think that's everyone. Yes, that's everyone. So let's move on. It's just really helpful to know, who's in the conversation, and it's interesting. We have perspectives from various ends of the supply chain and bits in the middle. I want to acknowledge we don't have any traders and brokers with us in this conversation, and we don't have anyone from some of the stages like processing and manufacture. We had a conversation this morning in the Indian and Asia Pacific time zone, and there we had a really strong representation from folks in India, particular farmer representatives and various other farming related organizations. And the idea is that the collective output of both those sessions will inform our recommendations that we go forward. So this is part of a larger conversation. So in terms of what we're going to do now, in front of you on this Miro board, you see our simplistic representation of the cotton value chain. And we know that there are often different permutations of this, but we're looking all the way across from the farmers growing the cotton through the farmer representatives, the processing, through to the traders and the manufacturer, all the way through to where the cotton ends up with the brands and retailers. we have included consumers and the end of life in this value chain, because that is an important consideration, just in thinking about the impacts of consumer choices on how cotton is grown and the adaptation responses that are taken. So we're going to be looking across this value chain, and you can chip in from whatever perspective, whatever part of the value chain you're offering your perspective from. And we're going to be thinking about all the different hazards. So Neil is showing us the hazard key that summarizes the hazards that Erin presented earlier on. All these different hazards that we see here. And we're really working from the whole list of that chart that Erin spoke to us about earlier today, that you see off to the left, a very full set of different risks, and both direct and indirect risks. So we're asking you to really kind of speak from a collective picture of all those things put together. And our task, if we go to looking at the types of adaptation, we're really thinking about that first set that Alistair presented around informational types of adaptation. Just a reminder, he mentioned you might be monitoring trends, you might be doing seasonal forecasting, you might be training in adaptation responses, anything to do with information. Anything to do with institutions and governance. So this is about government policy, the kind of regulations and government support and guidelines that they set. It might be about public-private partnerships, anything involving institutions and governments. We're going to be talking from the perspective of capacity building, so skills training. That might be how you train up farmers. It might also be how you might work with building capacity of people in actors across the value chain. And we're also looking at it as from a perspective of contracting and insurance. So we talked about things like long-term contracting, or different types of insurance, different ways of engaging the finance sector, or the contracts with farmers. And the other group's going to be dealing with the other types of adaptation response. So let's make a beginning. And what we're going to do is choose either things that are currently being implemented, which Neil is going to write out on a green virtual Post-it note. Remember when we used to use real Post-it notes? These are virtual Post-it notes. And if you call out something that, as far as you know, doesn't exist yet, then that will be put on a yellow Post-it note for something that could be implemented. And you can speak them out. You can also put them in the chat if you prefer, although it'd be good to have a good conversation. And we're going to just address the whole value chain at once, so we won't necessarily start from farmers and work around to the other end. You can just call out, wherever we happen to be. So I hope that's clear. Any questions about that before we begin? Clear enough. Okay. Well, we'll get into it, and then anything that isn't clear, I hope will become so. So let's start first thinking about informational types of adaptation, and thinking about where that would be an appropriate response, given the urgency across the value chain, or where it already exists. What kind of informational responses might you be seeing? The floor is open. Anything you're aware of or think would be important?
I just have a question to that question, Charlene. When we talk about information, do we talk about the information for the farmers, or in
Could be
general? Because, for example, I think it comes to capacity building, and most of the farmers already know where to check the weather forecasts on a daily basis, but perhaps they do not know where to look for the forecast for the extended periods of time. So I don't know if that makes sense in terms of information.
Do you mean making climate change information more available to farmers so that they understand what's on the horizon? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And we know that the climate is changing, but perhaps they know how to access ways of getting the information, getting the alerts, for example, for any rainfalls predicted that could affect the sowing, things like that. Or again, the information related to the insurance options for the farmers, so that they could, for example, purchase an insurance in case there's a sudden rainfall and the first sowing and the first crop just sown is gone. And for example, they don't have funds to purchase another set of seeds to resow again.
Thank you.
So that, just to chip in there, that would be some sort of a parametric insurance type of thing. So I guess maybe just to expand on that as well, identifying the barriers might be an important task. What are the barriers restricting farmers from accessing such parametric insurance?
Yes, so there's the financial restraint. So there is a problem with farmers sometimes not knowing where to go for the insurance, but of course there is an issue with not having enough funds to purchase the insurance. So it's a combined issue.
Thanks.
Somebody in the previous roundtable mentioned how, I think he said, once in 100-year events were now happening several times in a decade. And this was due to climate data being out of date. It strikes me when we talk about information and that point that you raised, Nishka, about the access to information. Is this a broader point that the sector needs to deal with? That it's not just farmers, but we're actually thinking about data. When we even use the data that we have, it's out of date and it's not effective.
And just as a prompt, because the conversation, can easily focus on information to farmers and producers, which is absolutely vital. But thinking about it also from the brands and the retailers' point of view or the consumer's point of view, what are some of the information that that would be most important for brands and retailers to have? And I'll kick the list off. For example, it would be really important for brands and retailers to know who's in their supply chain so that they can work with their supply chain to create solutions. And as we know, that's often not the case. But what other kind of information would brands, retailers, and consumers need to have?
I think directly, like on your point, Charlene, is directly related to what are the farmers in that supply chain? What are the risks that they're directly facing? And I always say with Cotton Diaries, the reason why we're taking a different storytelling approach is because it's more human and it has a face to it. It doesn't have data. It brings it to life. And so I think not only for the brands and the retailer, but also for the consumers, because I think the realization that our supply is based on an unstable situation, it makes everything, I think, more real. And when it's related to a specific person and then directly to you and to your supply chain. I mean, I live in Spain and it's not that possible unless you live in Andalusia to relate it to cotton. But then with other food crops, it happens, I think, to a certain extent. When you have a flood event and it's your neighbor, then it's more gets more real. So I think that type of information.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that just brings out the point that of course it would be possible if you're sourcing from a region that has difficult climate impacts, it isn't able to, to produce in a given period, you could switch your supply chain. But what we really need is a commitment to work with the actors in a supply chain to enable the farmers and people in the farming community to build that resilience and to really take a long-term approach.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe I'll come in there. I think in terms of the risk that farmers are facing, a key question for many of the farmers is when the risk produces itself, what are the actions that I can take, or when I'm planting a crop, or what measures can I take to adapt to highly likely or weather events or extreme weather events. So in Belgium, we are trying to look at specific sectors within farming and trying to kind of come up with a toolbox of different actions that a farmer could take in order to adapt. I think maybe there are farmers out there that don't know what that toolbox looks like. So the informational aspect would then be to inform them about what is out there and to expand the toolbox, of course, but there's work to be done in expanding the toolbox, but that's for the researchers. But then it's also has to get out there so that a farmer can judge what is best for his situation.
And that'll be specific to each region, right? The tools that you use will be very region specific.
Yeah, I think I'm working in a relatively small and very populated region, so the seasonal differences within that region are relatively limited. But yeah, I think you would need to have something that is crop specific and that is regional in terms of toolbox.
Yeah. And please go ahead.
I'm studying a master's in agroecology, and I have a lot of agronomists with me on the group, and none of them has done any course on climate change in their 3 or 5 years that they've studied. And so they've taken this agroecology course, which is very different for an institutional university. And I think what normally I get that the information that they absorb is how much fertilizers do I need to input in that field? And so it's based on chemical inputs, more or less, and some kind of soil science that is not very much based on climate-based decisions or anything like that. So I think we need to tackle also the information at university level if we want to make it very long-term and resilient in the sector, because this in agronomy is not taught it's not a class in most in most regions of the world. Maybe in Sweden, I've heard in some parts, but of the Nordic, but here in Spain is not. Not in Italy either.
Yeah, thank you, Marcia. And I just want to welcome Fabio to our breakout group. I'm glad you could join us. And I see you come from Abrapa. And in a moment, I'll just like you to briefly introduce yourself. But what we're doing is we're looking at across the cotton value chain and thinking about adaptation responses in terms of a range of adaptation responses, including information at the moment. And then just highlighting what already exists that we see out there that's effective, that's on those green Post-its, and what are the things that we think are needed that we don't see currently available, and those are on the yellow Post-its. But Fabio, you wanted to say a quick hello and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Charlene, and hello everyone. I'm sorry about my delay today, and but it's a pleasure to be with you again. I'm just arrived in the room, so I'm trying to feel what's going on, but I feel very comfortable to say about the fertilizer and how the Brazilian experience and how we can help. We have a really specific in different situation in Cerrado. So Cerrado is a good point for work. I think it's if we see Cerrado, but okay, whether it's
I'll get it right at some point, Fabio. Don't worry.
all right, but I don't know if I can help now, but I will be with you and try to give our experience in more detail in next time.
Okay, great. In a minute, we're going to move on to the next category. But before we do that, I just want to test one of the strong narratives that came out of this morning's conversation, which was, much more focused on India and therefore, particularly smallholder farmers, was that farmers as a whole are very unprepared, that they don't generally understand what the impacts of climate change are likely to be. They don't have the information to help them prepare for it and to be, active now in engaging in strategies to help them be resilient. And, given that the focus of this afternoon's conversation is, is in a region where the farms tend to be not primarily smallholders, but, larger, bigger farms. I wonder what your perspective is, perhaps Fabio and Kelly in particular, what do you think farmers' informational needs are to help them adapt?
Well, as you implied, I mean, in the larger farmer scenario, there's much better information sources, but probably you still have an aspect of farmers are slow to change, and so there will be needs for information, but in the US, with the extension service and different things that exist, I would assume gradually, the information will be out and it will happen much easier than in the smallholder scenario.
Yeah, I agree with Kelly. It's commercial farms, more information available for them to change or to try to improve and gathering the informations in activities. But I think the information available is not so easy getting the small farms, and why that's happening. We need to help for get the better information for them and try to improve, because we have costs about couple things for do that, and so when the costs come through, this makes harder to then accept couple change. So I think the costs in a commercial farms for certification or kinds like that, it's easier to get in they accept that. And that we have a lot of problems with the smaller farmers when we have a certification cost, for example, or small things. For when costs come through it, we have a lot of problems to get in.
Thank you. So we've been talking so far about informational type responses. Let's move to think about institutional and governance policy type responses, which is, massive. We know that climate change is not something that, can be tackled without involvement of government. But, what kind of responses are you aware of that already exist or that will be needed? Thinking about institution, government, policy, regulation. What are your thoughts about that?
I'm sorry, like I have a lot of thoughts.
Please, go ahead.
I mean, I think data transparency is a huge one, a push for it. At the moment, I've done a paper on misinformation in cotton. Data around water was easy to access. Data around pesticides and their impact was really hard to access. And I think there needs to be a push around data transparency or climate impact of practices that are not so transparent right now. And if it's regulated and it's not up to a market research company behind huge paywalls, I think it'll be easier also to inform the public around. I don't know if that makes sense. My thought is quite.
Yeah, what I'm getting is that one of the things that's going to be essential for helping everybody know how to adapt is to understand what's happening and to have access to data. And what I hear you saying is that it really needs to be publicly available. It needs to be a public good and not held behind, needs to be public available.
Yeah.
What would be a good example? What would be a good example of a policy in this area for your mind? Like, what would be a good kind of policy response to this issue?
I think legally binding reporting for multinational companies that, so like Bayer, Corteva, all of these, they need to publicly disclose the impact on pesticides. At the moment, I know they buy all their application data from one company, which has all the data on pesticides application, not sales, which is super different, which is Kinetec. And so oblige some company to have some kind of minimal amount of data out in the public. So yeah, reporting, I think, on their climate impact, transparently available and by crop, by active ingredient, and yeah, I think also by country. And yeah, I mean, I have a basic table I can share with you of my wish list.
Great, thank you.
Well, drilling in on something that she said triggered something with me. Research and information that's needed. In general, in the big push in response to climate change, the focus is on reducing tillage, no tillage. And what I see happening is in the commercial farming scenario, there's movement in that direction, which is a good thing, but it involves a tremendous amount of herbicide use. And there's research out there that would indicate the herbicide use somewhat negates the benefit of the no-till from a soil health standpoint. And nobody's really talking about that.
So what would be, following Neil's question, what kind of policy response do you think is needed? Or might be needed?
I mean,
I'm putting you on the spot here, Kelly.
Well, and I don't have a lot of answers, but as again, Marzia implied, the information is basically proprietary, and we need, I guess, governments funding research that can be available to everybody. Mm-hmm. And then that guiding policy. But the powers that are there control so much, that including government. So it's all difficult.
Yeah.
I think maybe I can come in there. I think from a European perspective, what has been happening in the Common Agricultural Policy, which is the European policy, is that they have been stimulating farmers to work together to come together in what they call operational groups. So there is funding for them to come together and to discuss issues such as the one that Kelly was describing, with you tackle one issue with no tillage and you enter up with another issue. So the operational group can make that visible, and then they can link up with research institutes or with consultants that actually help to figure out a solution for them. So the policy instrument here is subsidizing multi-actor groups, as they call them, where thematic issues that are living bottom up, let's say at the operational level, are being dealt with from a bottom up perspective. Sometimes policy measures are then linked to that in terms of investment. For example, investment subsidies for saying irrigation or whatever, or government policies that are supporting entering into an insurance scheme, for example, which is, or setting up an insurance scheme itself, which is often too costly or not interesting for the insurer themselves, but some of the burden of default would be taken by government. So that could be also something as government policy.
Thanks.
Can I just say this? Just what you've said there really excites me, because too often when we have these discussions about adaptation, it's about the stick, you know, putting a framework on top of farmers, putting a framework and trying to incentivize through restrictions, or by essentially telling people off. But everything you've just described there was very much a carrot, and it was a de-risking model rather than a stick. And from what I've read, from what I've understood, what I continue to read about and discuss with people across the sector, is that there's not a lot happening in this space, this carrot, particularly at a policy and governance level. So that's what you've just put down there, I think is really exciting. So thanks for your thoughts.
Mm.
And I think on what you said, Wim, here there's in Catalonia, there's a fund for farmers to access extension services. And normally when you have an extension service that has some kind of climate adaptation understanding, I think you can access, here there's in the Montes, there's like 700 euros worth of extension service consulting for one farmer. And some farmers put all their funding together and they do groups, workshops. And so they, yeah, it's very effective, not on climate, but it's a model that I think it works quite well in certain regions.
Thank you, Marcia. And I'd love to continue with government and policy, but with our time ticking, I also want to move on to capacity building, which I know is a massive area, as well as having some time for contracting and insurance. So can I switch the conversation to think about what is needed in terms of capacity building types of responses, you know, skills training, or it might be, you know, engaging communities, different stakeholders. What's coming up around capacity building?
Can I throw my personal curveball in here, which is something that I've been thinking about, which is that how in consumer societies there is, you know, just there's always so much focus on what the producer or people earlier in the supply chain need to do, and there isn't nearly enough about what we need to do as consumers in terms of understanding and whether or not we really understand these issues around sustainability and where we're buying from and so on. And one thing that I think that we need to do better is educating, capacity build ourselves as consumers around these different issues. And you could even think about starting that as young as school. Like, why do we have to be so boxed into workshops and webinars for the interested, when actually this is an issue that's going to affect everybody, and therefore this is something that we could actually be, you know, making sure that people understand at a young age rather than having to change their minds as adults. Just one thing that's been playing on my mind recently.
Thank you, Neil. You can put that on a post-it. But I think that the point is that you know, this can't just be something that the farmers have to deal with. You know, that there is a responsibility that somehow needs to translate to the consumer, and a need for some capacity building and understanding on the consumer's part about their choices. And
I would, sorry.
I was going to ask you to come in, Nicola. That's great.
There you go. You got me. Yes, so it's a good point, Neil. And I was thinking that it works as well from a brand perspective. That same thing is that there needs to be more capacity building and understanding. And I guess it goes back in a way to the information bit at the beginning, is that we need, you know, from the start, sort of more sort of risk analysis on a regional level for brands, so that they have a more comprehensive understanding of what those risks are, so that they can plan ahead earlier, and understand, you know, what cotton products they could use instead. Should they be investing more in regenerative, certified regenerative, or, you know, or pilot projects and whatever. So yeah, definitely there needs to be more training and some more thorough understanding.
Great, thank you. What other kind of capacities do we need to build?
I'm just thinking, to what extent do consumers actually know that there is so little capacity for farmers to react to this? Extension services are mentioned, but certainly from a European context, in the last 30, 40 years, extension services have been decimated. Governments have been totally neglecting them. And I'm not sure to what extent consumers are aware of that lack that is now being built back with operational groups and so on. But there could be a role for brands or consumer organizations to help that capacity building.
Yeah.
And also maybe just taking discussion to the wider community level impact as well, and the community capacity building potential for the wider communities associated with the cotton supply chain. Just reminding of the India analysis that we did as part of the first year, where we're looking at different indicators to do with socioeconomic indicators, and relating those then to climate change. So by building resilience, by decreasing vulnerability of communities, that you're increasing resilience against climate change. And so the more holistic view as well in that sense.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that's a point that we can never bring out strongly enough, that, you know, we're talking very objectively about a future which is going to be really difficult to live in, and people are going to be struggling to grow stuff, to, you know, to just carry on with their lives. And this came out really strongly in our first conversation, and that the kind of capacities that we need to build are not just, you know, they're not just technical. They'll also be an ability to support one another through many difficult situations that will be happening as different, you know, incidents hit. I'm just thinking about, you know, wildfires in Australia when they hit a couple of years ago. You know, they did material damage, and there were also communities that were really devastated. So what are the capacities that we might need on a community level to just support people so that they can, you know, carry on with their lives? Other thoughts about capacity building, and then we'll go on and talk about contracting and insurance.
I think it was an information that I was talking about, maybe on capacity building more than information at university.
Yeah. one of the points that came out a lot in this morning's conversation was the need for collaboration across the whole supply chain. And I think that's hard for a lot of, actors in the supply chain, either because they don't know who the other actors are, or they don't know how to engage with the other actors they're connected to in the supply chain.
Do you think this comes down to this? I wrote this here kind of on purpose and quite pertinently for me, because traders are the ones who have, I guess, their hands in multiple pies, right? And kind of straddle various aspects of the supply chain, at least as I understand it. Is there a role for them to be, I mean, I think tying up a few of these different responses in terms of connecting the supply chain, being more transparent, ensuring that farmers have more information, ensuring that consumers have more information and retailers have more information, because I feel like they can be a missing piece of the puzzle that often operates somewhat behind the scenes.
Yeah. And any other comments on capacity building before we go into the last category? Any critical capacity building measures, or really good ones that you know about?
Well, a technical one that I don't know the cotton industry well enough for is seed improvement. I don't know.
Yeah, that came out really strongly this morning, both seed improvement and also uptake of native species that might be more climate resilient. Okay, so we have a last category around contracting and insurance. And, this is the parametric insurance that you talked about, Erin, different ways of engaging with insurers, and also, some really novel approaches to risk sharing through contracts, or brands and retailers, where they have vertically integrated supply chains, having long-term contracts with farmers, or other forms of long-term contracting. So I'd like to hear, are you aware of examples where this is working, or what do you see that might be needed? Any thoughts?
Veja has a good model of, and we're promoting within Cotton Diaries the idea of an agricultural budget that every brands need to implement. If you are part of the cotton supply chain, that means that you're part of an agricultural supply chain, and you have marketing budgets, you then have to have an agricultural budget too. And so by having that, it's not a contract, but it's kind of a commitment towards improving the supply chain.
Who was that, Mazia? Was it Veja, the shoe company?
Yeah, the shoe. Veja has, I don't know their contracting, Veja, their contracting model, but they have long-term commitments with their farmers where they have shared risks. So they have a commitment upfront. And for a very long time, they've been working in the same regions. And also they have inside their team, they have an agronomist who goes and visit farmers constantly to do capacity building, etc. So it's not contracting. It's not just contracting. It's way more than that. My biggest question for brands is how, and for traders as well, if we keep going in a commodity model, how can we do this work? It's anonymous. and we keep talking about transparency, traceability, knowing the farmer. Let's be honest, cotton doesn't work this way. And it's, I don't know, I don't understand how we can talk about these with still a model that it's not built, and it seems to be a very little willingness to change it from institutions or a lot of interests.
Thank you, Marcia. I know
Sorry.
we've got just a couple of minutes left. Any other thoughts about insurance and contracting before we wrap up?
Well, an issue that's big in our situation, but not necessarily all over the world, but with climate change could become more so. Contracting between farmers and brands is difficult when there's such unknowns on production quantity and quality. Even with transparency and relationships, which we have, we have not come up with good solutions for dealing with the unknowns. A brand needs a set supply and a farmer has no idea what they're going to have.
Thanks, Kelly.
I would add a couple of things, Charlene. It's about the long-term negotiation here in Brazil and the large farms. We have a lot to improve in the insurance and the other things to make the investments be profitable and to keep insurance available, because Brazilian farmers are not added very much about insurance, and it's make a lot of issues in contracts. We have a delay or a change or a climate change if we have. So I think we need to keep cotton production and we need folks in insurance for make our production sustainability in the long term for keep increasing.
Thank you, Fabio. So I know in a minute we're going to be whisked back into the plenary, but this has been really amazing, and we've got quite a set of mostly, I noticed mostly yellow Post-its, which would suggest that no, there's not as much available out there to build on as it needs to be. When we get back to the plenary, we're going to just share some of the highlights or some of the examples and key points. And I wondered if, without putting anybody in the spot, I wondered if Kelly, Marcia, and Fabio, you could each share a brief example of some of the things that have come up for you. Marcia, in particular, the Veja example I thought was really interesting. Well, actually, then maybe I'll do this differently, because Wim, you've brought some really interesting things too. Who would be willing to speak when we go back in the plenary, just, for 1 or 2 minutes, sharing some of these examples?
Well, I think my things were pretty peripheral and I'd rather not.
Okay, I won't put you on the spot then, Kelly.
I'm sure Neil can do a really good job.
No, Neil can't do it. He's going to be busy doing other things. If you could share the Veja example, that would be great, Marcia.
I think I'm not comfortable with it because I don't know the reality of it very deeply into the details. Fabio, I don't know if you're in touch with Veja, but yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward. A lot of people would know probably from the group that they have a different model. Okay. All right. Well, no, but I don't want to force anybody to report back to the plenary. So unless anybody wants to volunteer, then Neil and I might have to do it. Volunteers? Okay, Neil, you're on. We'll see you. We'll see you back in the plenary in about 40 seconds, and we'll take it from there. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I think we're just waiting for, the other group hasn't come yet. So we'll hang on a minute while everybody assembles. Here they come. All right, so we are back from our plenary sessions, and we're going to hear a brief summary of examples of adaptation that came up in these discussions, and also what's starting to emerge as the priority areas. And I know in our group we didn't get as far as talking about
which needs a collaborative response, but that's something to be bearing in mind. And maybe we can start, Deval, with your group. Would you like to give us a summary of what began to come up?
Sure. So maybe before I try and summarize some of the areas that we discussed, and we had a lovely discussion. Maybe could I ask Fabiana first, and then Stephen and Deepika, if you could share in a couple of minutes some of the great examples that you shared in terms of what you're already doing, or where you see the needs for adaptation, starting with Fabiana. And if I could request you all, if I could request you all to be sort of limit your responses to 2 minutes at the max. Thanks.
Hi, absolutely. So in terms of financial, I shared that being a grower, we already have some financial incentives from the banks regarding to the funds. So if we can prove that we have metrics related to an improvement on climate change, on sustainability aspects overall, the banks has some sort of products that they can offer a better rate in terms of funding the crops. So that was something that we covered. In terms of operation, we discussed about how being efficient in terms of input usage, and we talked about the precision agriculture, understanding what the land requires in terms of inputs. Stephen also brought the topic of fertilizers. What if we do need as much as fertilizer that the modern agriculture is used to use? That was something that there is room for adaptation responses. And in terms of social, we talked about transparency. I think that being more transparent, the whole supply chain can contribute and can actually have actions towards a more social, fair environment, socially speaking.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fabiana. Lovely. Stephen, if you could share some of your insights, please.
Sure. Yeah, Fabiana did a great job summarizing some of those things we talked about. To the finance side, I just wanted to note we have this ecosystem services market that's developing, and is there any way that the finance community could play a role in helping kind of spur that? And one example of what's happening in the US is USDA announced recently they have $3 billion set aside to fund this climate smart agriculture and forestry partnerships initiative. So that money will be coming out in the next couple months, so to kind of drive this exact thing. So that'll be great. For operational, just thinking about the cradle to grave impacts of a cotton shirt, most of the impacts in a global warming perspective come from textile manufacturing. So is there any way we can incentivize renewable energy use adoption there? Could the financial sector play a role, since energy use is driving the majority of those impacts? Fabiana indicated this nitrogen use efficiency and some of these historic recommendations that are out there. Could we perhaps revisit those, get the same yields, maybe similar or even improve yields due to soil health building practices, conservation ag practices that are being adopted, and then we have less inputs? Also, by using precision agriculture, could we kind of stem that as well? Last but not least, the social category. Somebody mentioned in our group trying to incentivize the repair and kind of resale market. Could that be a way to expand employment opportunities in sectors where it's currently not there? So that's what I have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephen. And Deepika, you want to add anything else? Yeah.
Yep. Thank you, Stephen and Fabiana. You guys made it really easy for me. So just wrapping up to all the points that we talked about. We definitely did talk about the finance side. Stephen and Fabiana did a great job on covering that. So I'm just going to talk about the operations. Currently, 74% of the growers, US cotton farmers, are doing precision agriculture. So we were trying to find out what are some of the adaptation responses, what are some of the priority areas. One of the priority areas we talked about is the energy use, how it is important because that is the main source for emissions, and what can we do on basing on that. We talked about a little bit on regenerative agriculture, how growers are doing some other forms of regenerative agriculture. And we also talked about the transparency system. One thing Alistair brought up a great point. Sorry if I butchered your name again. If a great point is who is responsible, who need to step forward. And we all came to a common conclusion that all of us are equally responsible. So, and we are doing a great part by starting to have this conversation today. So yay to all of us for that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Deepika. And thank you all, Fabiana, Stephen, Deepika, for sharing those. So the only thing that I would add is, in terms of sort of the broader themes, one was we need collaborative actions across the value chain, something that we've been highlighting, but we had more tangible examples of how this could be done. And we heard about traceability a number of times, but the thing that really sort of came out in our discussion is some of the challenges currently around traceability and transparency are also the sort of some of the most significant impediments around collaboration on several of the adaptation responses required. So when we think about sort of some of the priority areas, some of the technologies and tools that might be available, but there might be other kinds of responses as well that advanced traceability might really help advance the adaptation outcomes on a number of areas. Alistair, is there anything else that you would like to share?
No, I think that's captured very well. Thank you. Perfect.
Thank you. Back to you, Charlene.
I'm very impressed with your feedback as your group. You're a tight team. So for feedback for our group, I'm going to first delegate to Neil, and then if any others of the group feel like they'd like to speak up and chip in, then I will invite you to do so. But Neil, could you kick us off? Neil, have you gone somewhere?
No, I'm here and still on mute. So I'll pick up actually where Deval just left off, because one of the examples that was given just on that data, just on this intersection between transparency and institution and information, was we were also mentioning a key gap was in transparency of data. And Wim, I believe it was, raised the point from a Euro perspective, which was there are now kind of increasing efforts to bring farmers together in, I believe, what are called operational groups to discuss issues, and then where these kind of solutions to these issues are creating further problems. And this kind of bottom-up approach of testing out bringing perspectives and testing out these types of solutions and seeing if they're actually making a difference was a really interesting one, especially because some of our respondents in other markets mentioned that as a key gap. One interesting kind of example that was raised was really, not one specific one, but just in this difference between larger commercial farms and smallholder farms, in the meaning of smallholders really struggle with access to information, especially around climate change. These information sources are inaccessible sometimes, or maybe don't make sense. Whereas larger commercial farms, broadly speaking, have more access to these types of information sources. Whether or not they do something about them is a different question. But these commercial farms that dominate, perhaps farming in North America, for example, means that they do have access to those types of sources. And the third really key one that was mentioned at the end was that of Veja, the shoe company. And they're a really interesting one. I think most of us will have heard them because they've been doing it for a really long time, but they set the price for their contracting with producers. So they set that in advance. They buy organic and agroecological cotton, and they try and give cotton producers greater financial security with this model. This does mean that their cost of production is reportedly 5 times higher than others. But they see this as a really urgent and critical aspect in order to bring fairness to their relationship to the producers. But Charlene, as I'm sure you'll point out, we actually had slightly more gaps than we did examples, perhaps. So back over to you.
Yeah, let me just see. Does anybody else from the team want to add anything? Okay. Okay, no takers. We had a shyer group, but a brilliant group in terms of responses. And I think the one thing that I would want to call out, that, you know, there were so many things there, but one of the themes that was particularly strong was about making data available and not having it be proprietary. That there will be such a strong need for data to understand what's going on, what's working. And I guess a risk is that that data won't be readily available. You know, that'll be owned by groups that that use it but don't share it. And so a really important adaptation response is, how do you make data, you know, really available as a public good so that everybody can benefit? So that really brings us to the end of the breakouts. And here I'm going to do something that we didn't do this morning, but I think it would just be really useful to hear. If you could say any one of the things that we've talked about is really top priority. If you were to say, you know, what one thing would you do? What do you think is the highest priority for adaptation? What would it be? And I'm just going to ask you to put it in the chat. And I'm just really interested to see what comes up. I know it's a big question, and there are a gazillion things that need to be done, but if you could do one thing that you think is most important. Thank you. Yeah. So we see a point from Fabian about Fabio about market commitments, financial incentives, supply chain transparency, incentivize producers to adopt climate smart practices. Really interesting. Okay. Have conversations across supply chain on emerging issues, education across the supply chain. That's been a big one. Across both geographical conversations. Cross departments objectives, financial support for farmers. And I guess what a lot of this brings up for me is we heard a lot this morning about the need to have cross-sector collaboration on adaptation, and that, you know, in order to do that, you know, being co-creative and participatory from Marcia, in order to do that, you know, do need education and support and facilitation, and incentives. So thank you. That's a really interesting snapshot for us. Oh, here's another one. Adopting unconditional production adaptation models across the value chain. So where that brings us to is the end of today's conversation. I just want to do a quick look about what happens next and what are we going to do with all the information that you've shared and co-created today. As we mentioned earlier, this was the second workshop, so this is a later time group, a bit more representative of Europe and the Americas. This morning's was very much India and Asia dominated. And so we'll put the results of both of those groups together to answer questions, you know, what does good look like? What are the high priority areas for adaptation responses? And then coming into our next roundtable, we'll really look at what do we mean by a future that we see as just and regenerative, which is increasingly what we in Forum are using as a replacement for the word sustainable, because we can see that in order to get to a viable future for cotton, we need to regenerate and we need to embed greater justice across the value chain. So we'll be looking a bit next time at how is this different to some of the older mindsets around reducing impact, or trying to do better in a bad system, to really moving forward to create a cotton value chain that has justice and regeneration at its heart. And very importantly, we'll be mapping all the areas for adaptation responses, and we'd be looking at what are the top priorities, out of all these different areas where so much response is needed. Where do we start? And we'll be trying to get a sense of what the priorities are, both on a global level and perhaps also by geography. And then really critically talking about how can we, we in the broadest sense, all the people who've been involved in this conversation and some of those who perhaps we would like to be involved in the conversation, how can we come together as a sector to begin to enable these responses? Some organizations may be able to go out and do things in their own supply chains, which may not need a whole sector approach, but we think most of the responses that are needed are going to take people working together. And so the whole point of these conversations and the whole point of the reports sharing the impacts of climate change that we produced together with Willis Towers Watson was to enable this kind of joined up conversation to say, okay, what do we do? And what's the most important thing to do now? So that will be the focus for our next conversation on the 14th of December. So we hope you will come back and participate in that. Please do invite others to participate in that. And just to be really clear, what we hope will be an outcome from those conversations will be a few key areas that we can begin to curate some collaborative initiatives around. So we'll be looking for particular things that might need piloting or testing or developing. We go to the next slide, please. This is just another reminder that there is an open invitation to partner with us or join with us in the Cotton 2040 initiative to continue working on this. So the working group has been involved along all the stages of the journey, and some of you are members of that working group. But if you aren't, you're very welcome to join us. And that's a working group that really brings together perspectives from across the industry to advise and support how we move forward with developing these appropriate climate responses. And I already invited you for the 14th of December, so please do come. Deval, anything more from you on closing out today's conversation?
No, nothing else, Charlene. Just thank you everyone for joining and for those wonderful insights. And as Charlene said, just emphasize the third roundtable is is the climax, at least for this phase, where all the great discussions and conversations we've had until now come together, and we start to get more specific around some of the actions we could take collaboratively. So looking forward to seeing you all for that roundtable. And thanks again for joining today.
Thank you. And any final comments from anyone in the group? Any words that you'd like us to take away?
That was great. Thank you for convening.
That's really great. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Wim, did you want to add something to that?
No, I echoed what has been said. I think it's in content and process. It's good. It's quite interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And we're just so aware that, so many of these conversations are needed, and we're just beginning. So thank you what you said earlier, Deepika. So that brings us to a close. What we would like to ask is for your feedback on today's session. These are the beginning of, what I hope will be many conversations about adaptation. So we'd like to use your feedback to know how we might improve and continue to improve. It'll take you just 2 minutes, we promise. And other than that, we can give you the rest of your evening back or your day back, depending on what time zone you're in. And just really grateful for the quality of dialogue that we've had today. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
See ya.